As always, I remind you that we love to see your faces, and if you can swing it, we know some of you have different reasons that you don't put your faces up, and that's okay. We never want you to miss a class simply over that, but if you can put your faces up, it sort of feels like we have more people attending. There we go. Get to see pretty Mary. How so good to see you. You look great. See that? If you put your face up, you get a compliment. Wonderful. And why not if it's true? So, okay. And we'll start right now. It's time, 7:00 p.m. Here we go. Now, we're past David and Goliath, and David in Hebrew, now has become a national hero to the degree that people actually dance in the streets at parades, celebrating that while King Saul, Melech Shaul, has killed his thousands of enemies, David has killed his tens of thousands. In Hebrew, Shaul HaMelech has killed alafim, and David has killed rivavot, tens of thousands. And Saul cannot abide that David now is being praised publicly in parades as the greater hero. I told a story. Denise was sharing with me a story that she was reading tell a story about, she was reading it in a book of Jewish humor, and I actually had heard the same joke 20 years earlier. Tell the story about a guy named Shapiro from Brooklyn, and his friend happens to tells another guy, you know, you don't appreciate who Shapiro, our neighbor, is. Shapiro is the most famous person in the world. You think he's just some little Jew in Brooklyn. He is the world's most famous person. And the neighbor says, come on, you Shapiro. I know Shapiro. I see him in the butcher store. Well, next day he turns on TV. He's watching the national news, and there's the president of the United States in the White House, and standing at the microphone near the president of the United States, somehow is Shapiro. Well, that's a pretty big thing. Next day he's watching the news. There's a news conference in the United Nations. General Assembly, the Secretary General of the UN is speaking, and who's standing right behind him? Shapiro. Well, just so happens it's April, and this Jew from Brooklyn happened to have Passover season vacation planned with his wife to go to Italy, and very often Passover comes out the same time as Easter. And while he's in Italy, you know, you got to go to Rome, and if you're in Rome, you got to go to the Vatican, and it's Easter Sunday. And this from very religious Orthodox Jew is told you can't go to, it's Easter, so you got to go to St. Peter's the square and see. So anyway, you got to see the Pope. It's his Urbi and Orbi speeches. So this fellow from Brooklyn goes to the Vatican, St. Peter's Square, and there's the big moment. And the door opens up, and out come two people. And everybody's cheering, and this Jew from Brooklyn looks at the Italian guy next to him, speaks a little English, and he says, I was here, I was told that I should come here and I would get to hear the Pope. Can you tell me which one is the Pope? And the Italian guy says, yeah, he's the guy standing next to Shapiro. So anyway, that's Shapiro. So that's who King David had become. King David had become the Shapiro of biblical times, and King Saul didn't like that. And because King Saul was going through depression, and it was part of God's plan that King Saul had lost the dynasty and David would become the next king. David secretly already has been anointed by Shmuel, Samuel the prophet, although Saul doesn't know it. If Saul knew it, he would have Samuel killed. Consequently, Saul right now suspects David is the one whom God has chosen. Since Saul was told by the prophet Shmuel that he's going to lose his dynasty after his death, it's not going to go to his son Jonathan, Yonatan. He's beginning to suspect David's the one. And that's where we come in today. We learned at the end of class last week that he very much wanted to somehow destroy David. So he did two things. He appointed David to be like a general in his army in the front lines, figuring that will increase greatly the chances that David dies in war. So instead of Saul killing David, a national hero, let the Philistines kill him in battle and let him die a national hero, but get him out of the picture. And secondly, Saul sets up for David to marry one of Saul's daughters, turns out to be Michal. He was going to marry him to Merav, but she got married to this gentleman, Adriel, so he marries him off to Michal. And he figures my daughter Michal is reliable and loyal to me, and she will, from inside the home, drive him crazy and drive him to distraction that also will lead him to lose focus and die at battle.
Rabbi?
But it turns
Actually,
I'll take it 1 second, John. But it turns out Michal loves him. And so she's there to protect him. And Saul didn't count on that. Yes, Janet?
actually, with Michal, Saul's line does continue through grandchildren, even if David is anointed. So a grandchild may end up being king.
That's an interesting way to look at it. But
And that's Roger's point, actually.
But it will turn out that Michal will not have children. And David's line, King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, will come from Bathsheba. And he will have some other children from some other wives. He will end up having quite a few wives. And Michal, as we will learn in the text, I don't like to do spoilers, but we will learn that Michal is not going to have children. And we'll learn why. It's a very good point, because had everybody played it nice, and it's the old story, if everybody just played it nice, you're absolutely right. It would have been King Saul's grandchildren. So there would have been like a loss, and technically it would be the dynasty of David, but it would be the dynasty of Saul too. Just as when we think of King David, we think of Ruth. Although technically patrilineally by the father, it goes down through, let's say, Boaz, who was the father married to Ruth, the mother that led to the lineage of David. But we still all talk about how David stems from Ruth. In the same way, you're absolutely right. He would have stemmed from the Saul dynasty. And we'll see how it works out. Thank you for that, Janet. Let's continue. Chapter 19. So, Vayedaber Shaul Yonatan beno, Yokol al Vadav lehamit David. So Saul wants David dead, tells his son Jonathan he wants him dead, but Jonathan loves him as a brother. And so Jonathan discloses to David, my father Saul wants to kill you. And therefore, I think we need this. Here's what I recommend. At the top of every month, Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of every Hebrew month, there is a big public celebration, Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, or in the Hebrew calendar, every other month actually is 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. First, there are actually 2 days because the Jewish calendar is based on the moon. It's called a lunar calendar. And actually, a lunar month, the time from one moon to become a new moon is 29 and a half days. So half the months are 29 days, and half the months you have 30 days. So there's two Rosh Chodesh days. So anyway, this is going to be a 2 Rosh Chodesh day. Anyway, there's a big celebration every month, and the king sits at the dais, and all the celebrities and VIPs, the most important people in the kingdom, sit at the dais with the king. And by now, David is one of them, the great military hero. So Saul sits there, and his son Yonatan sits there. David sits there. So Yonatan is going to tell David, we have one of those coming up. I recommend you don't show up on the first day. Don't show up because my dad I think he wants to kill you. But let me talk to my dad. Let me see if he was just having a bad spell, whether he really intends to kill you. And so sit out the first day, and then I will let you know whether you're in danger. Okay, let's understand that. Continuing. So, therefore, take heed to thyself in the morning and wait in a secret place, hide yourself. I'll go out and be with my dad, not far from the field where you're hiding. And I'll speak to my dad and I'll see what he has to say. And I'll let you know. And so Yonatan sees his father and he speaks well of David. Spoke good of David, spoke well of David. Actually spoke good. All right. And talks to his father and he says, Al Yechatam Melch B'Avdo David, Dad, please don't sin against David, your servant. Kilo Chatalach, he hasn't done anything against you. V'chima asav tov v'chamaod, all his deeds are only for your benefit, to uphold and support and strengthen your kingdom. Vayasem et nafsho b'chapo, vayachat haplishtin, he put his very life in your hands when he smote that Philistine Goliath. And God made a miracle. You saw, ra'ita v'tismach. You saw and you rejoiced. So how could you, God forbid, spill innocent blood to kill an innocent David without cause? Saul listened, and he was past a depression spell. And he heard his son, and by Shavashal, Yamut, he swore to his son, he shall not be put to death. And he swore in the name of God, he will not be killed. So Yonatan said, the coast is clear. Yonatan called David and told him all these things. And Yonatan brought David to Saul, knowing that he's safe. And all was good. And now there's another war. Philistines constantly with the war. It's like if you read the news out of Israel, the Arabs never stop. Every time you think that Israel's beaten them in war, the Arabs just start to regroup to do it again. Every 6 months, they just wait till they can build up more weapons and send in the next tribe. They'll never stop. But Tosaf and Milchamaliot, so there was another war with the Philistines, yet again. By the way, reminds me, 2 things I wanted to share with you up front. First of all, I happened to find, do you remember, we were learning about how the king had told David that he wanted him to bring back 200 Philistine foreskins. We talked about it last week. I actually saw a depiction of this. It's okay, it's family friendly, but I just thought I'd share it. I was looking, and here's a depiction of David at the battlefield, all the dead Philistines, and he's got a bag filled with foreskins. Just wanted to share with you an artist's rendition. Again, to remember that here's Israel. At that point, it was not a divided country of Kingdom Judah and Kingdom Israel, but one complete country under King Saul. It wasn't yet based in the capital of Jerusalem, but in Hebron. Actually, David ruled in Hebron also in the beginning for 7 years. Then he went to Jerusalem. And our next door neighbors were the Philistines. And they're just constantly a plague. And I wanted to share one more thing with you before we go forward with the text. A Gemara, a segment of the Midrash, an interesting thought about King David. The Midrash in Shmot Rabbah, it's actually discussing Moshe Rabbeinu. And it's talking about how God selected Moses to be the shepherd of the Jewish people who would shepherd us out of Egypt. And that he selected a person who was a shepherd. that is a shepherd shows a characteristic of caring for the entities under his custody. He learns to care for every sheep, make sure they're healthy, make sure they all can keep up when the flock goes to graze, make sure they all eat, cares for them. There's a certain kind of compassion, a loving kindness that a shepherd has. But there was another thing about Moses the shepherd. One of the concerns in shepherding, where are they going to graze? Whose grass will the sheep be grazing at? Because it is not unusual for shepherds to take their sheep out to the field and just have them graze where there's a lot of grass, without really dealing with the ethical dilemma of having your sheep eating someone else's grass. That grass belongs, perhaps if it's not public fields, that belongs to someone. Maybe he wants it for his sheep. And it's not unusual for, especially in those times, for shepherds sometimes to graze his sheep at other people's property. And the Midrash points out that when Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, was called to God for the first time at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, Har HaElokim, when he saw the burning bush, how did it come to pass that he saw a burning bush? Because he was grazing his father-in-law's sheep, Jethro, who was, as the son-in-law, having married the daughter Tzipporah, he was grazing the sheep out in the desert, outside of an area that anyone possibly would have had property rights to, in order to avoid having the sheep grazing on someone else's grass. He didn't want to steal. That's what he was doing at the mountain in the desert, in the wilderness, when he was called to God. So God selected someone not only who had shepherding compassion, but who had manifested ethics. And the Midrash talks about that, and then says, by the way, he wasn't the only one, because that was who David was also. Let's see. Just wanted to share, like, why did God choose David? And you'll remember, King Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, had gone to the home of Yishai Jesse and was assigned to anoint one of the sons to be the next king. And Shmuel first thought the oldest and tallest and strongest, and then the next one. And God finally revealed, no, I have in mind the youngest of them all, the shepherd, David. And now we get a little bit more insight, like, what did God see in David? Let's take a look. Let's see if I can pull up some English for you. Otherwise, I'll just read it and translate it. So let's first of all take it there, and then we'll try to see if we can pull up some English. Let's try that. See if that made any good. Nope. Okay. So it's talking about David and what he did. So let's see. Umoshe hayaroeh. And Moses, it says in the Bible. Oh, there we have some English. Okay, see if we get there. Moshe was tending his father-in-law Yethro's sheep. One of the sheep ran away. Moses ran after it until it reached a small shaded place. There the lamb came across a pool, began to drink. As Moshe approached the lamb, he said, I didn't know you ran away because you were thirsty. Oh, you're so exhausted. He put the lamb on his shoulders and carried him back. The Holy One said, since you tend the sheep of human beings with such overwhelming love, by your life I swear, you shall be the shepherd of my sheep, Israel. First he brought out the smallest lambs to pasture, so they should graze on the soft tufts of grass. Then afterwards he brought out the old sheep so they could graze on the medium grass, and then the strong sheep on the toughest pasture. And that was Moshe's way. Okay, so not all of it is translated. Okay, that's what I'm here for, I guess. That's why they pay me the big bucks. Here we go. Moshe Yaroeh. So the point they make is the following. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu noten gedula la'adam. God does not grant greatness to a person, does not promote him to greatness, ad shebodgehu b'davar katan, until God first investigates that person's soul and character in a minute thing. It's one thing to be a public benefactor, to stand up at a public meeting and say, I pledge $100,000. If you're a billionaire and you barely would notice $100,000 missing, or to do some public thing to get your picture taken for the newspaper or magazine, or get a plaque. Question is, what do you do behind the scenes when no one's watching? That's when you learn a lot about a person. When they're not in the position to signal their virtue, they simply are virtuous. So God does not raise someone to greatness until he checks him out on a minor thing. And only afterwards, if that person is worthy, does God raise him to a greatness. And indeed, there were two great figures in history whom God, the Holy One, blessed is he, first investigated, inspected in a minor matter, and he found them to be worthy, faithful, trustworthy, and raised them to greatness. Badak LeDavid, but soon he investigated David, our David here, how he handled his sheep. Vilona Hagam Elabamidbar, and he saw that David quietly, without fanfare, only grazed his flock in the wilderness, Laharchikam min hagazel, in order to keep them far away from any possibility of stealing without paying for someone else's property. Shekin Eliyav Omer LeDavid, and we know that David shepherded out in the wilderness because when he was criticized by his oldest brother Eliab at the battle encampment, when David showed up, his father had sent David to the brothers at the battlefront to bring them some food and bring everybody else in the unit some food. And then David was asking what's going on here and what's the reward for the one who kills Goliath. And the oldest brother said, Eliab, the oldest brother, was, you may recall, criticizing David and saying, gee, you're sticking your nose into stuff. You're adventurous. You're a young adventurous kid. This is not your business. In fact, what business do you have abandoning the sheep in the wilderness? So we know from the text. We know from the text itself. When Eliab, the oldest brother, heard him speaking to the men, Eliab became angry and said, why did you come here? And with whom did you leave the few sheep in the wilderness? I know your impudence, your impertinence. So from this we see in the text, David had brought the sheep to the wilderness. Why? So as not to steal. Melamed shehaya David mekayem Mishnah. This teaches us that David actually comported with Jewish law. There's actually a law. Ein magadlin behema daka be'eretz Yisrael. In the first instance, sheep should not be raised in certain parts of Israel because it's a small country. It's not like the United States, where we have vast open areas. And okay, you have a vast open area in the Negev, but it's desert. And therefore, the Mishnah says it's a problem to do a lot of shepherding in Israel, in areas where you might end up shepherding on other people's land. So Amar Leah Kadosh Baruch Hu Nimsa Atan Ema Batzon. So God, the Holy One, blessed is he, said to David, I now see you are trustworthy and ethical when it comes to sheep and grazing. Therefore, Bo Ura'e Tsoni. Therefore, I'm assigning you to come forth and be the shepherd of my sheep. And then they cite Psalm 78, where it refers to that in a poetic way. And in the same way, they quote the chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, Shmot, where it talks about the same thing with Moshe Rabbeinu, with Moses. Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And that's, of course, where the next thing you knew, he gazed, there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed, etc., etc. Okay. So I wanted to share the Gemara with you to gain a further insight into King David before he became king, why God chose him. Okay. So David goes, and again, now that Saul has vowed never to kill him, or he won't be killed, so points David. David goes to war, and you know what happens. And he smites the Philistines mightily. Next thing you know, Saul goes back into let's call it a depression. The evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul. And he again decided to kill David. He's holding a spear, and David was back in the palace, as always, playing the harp for him. And Saul attempted to kill him with a spear. And David, as Saul thrust the spear, David kind of deked out of the way. The spear ended up spearing into the wall, and David fled that night. And he came to see, I don't know, I can't trust him, but I'm not staying here. And so now Saul already is out to kill him. Saul sent messengers to the house of David to watch him and slay him in the morning. And his wife, David's wife, Michal, as I explained, the name Michael is Michael, but Michal is a modern Hebrew name also for women. Michal told him, I really love you. You're going to have to get out tonight. If you do not flee from our home tonight, Machar ata mumat, Dad is going to kill you tomorrow. And the problem was, Saul had sent messengers to David's house to watch him. He actually had messengers posted at the door and gateway so that David could not get out. And in the morning, he would be killed. So knowing that he would not be able to get out, she lowered him through a window. You know, she tied like bed sheets together. She lowered him with bed sheets via a window so he could get out without the sentries seeing. And he fled and escaped. Then she took teraphim, that might be described as mannequins, and she placed them in the bed under a blanket. Okay, and she put a quilt of goat's hair at the head thereof, so that, you know, it would look like there's a person sleeping in bed. So Mama Rashotav, and she set it up like with a pillow and with everything, and she comes the next morning. Saul instructs his messengers, okay, it's daybreak, enter the house, bring me David, I'm going to kill him. They come in, and she says, he can't come out of bed, quiet, he's sleeping, he's sick. So now they go back and they tell the king, he's in bed, he's sick. So the king says, I want you to go back there, and I want you to take him out of his bed and we're going to kill him. Bring him up to me in the bed. Schlep the whole bed with you. I'm going to kill him. So the messengers came back, and as they started doing it, they found mannequins. I'm thinking, I've seen TV and movie shows, but I don't want to be silly, but the one that comes to mind immediately is Ferris Bueller. When he played hooky from school, he did something like that. Uchavir ha'izim marashotab. They found it was a fake mannequin in a bed. He's long gone. And Saul realized his own daughter had done him in, had done Saul in, had proven disloyal to her father. He says to her, Lama kacha rimitani, why did you deceive me, my own daughter? And you sent out my enemy to escape. And she did not want to confront her father and tell him, because I love him and because you are not being reasonable. She instead said, and it wasn't true, but she didn't want to get on his bad side. She said, Hu amar Eli shalcheni lama amitech. Daddy, he told me I have to help. He knew you were going to try to kill him. He told me he needs to get out. And because he knew you had people guarding the exits, he told me he's got to get out through the window and I've got to help him. And he said, you got to help me or I'll kill you. So what can I say? I had to do it to save my own life. There's a weakness in that. If she really wanted to help Dad, if that were her goal, she could have dropped the pillow. She could have dropped the bed sheets. As he was out being lowered, she could have dropped the bed sheets. He would have had them fall. So if you want to think about it, you want to think it through. So David fled for his life. And he went to Samuel. Where's he going to go? He's going to flee to his family? That's the first place the king is going to send messengers to look and pull him back. He didn't know where to go. So he went to the prophet Samuel. You got me into this. You anointed me. You're the only one in the entire universe besides me who knows the master plan. Vayagedlo et kol asher asalu Shaul, told Samuel that night everything that's been going on with King Saul. And it's an interesting, there's a Talmud. Talmud briefly talks about it, or maybe it's the Midrash. Let's see. Prepared this for you as well. Let's see. This is in something called Midrash Shmuel, a Midrash that talks about aspects of the book of Shmuel. And it talks about this. And it says, the David Barach Vayimalet, Vayavo El Shmuel Haramata. It is commenting on the words that I just read you, that David fled for his life and escaped, and he went to Ramah to the prophet Samuel and spent that night. Rav Huna b'shem Rav Yossi, Rabbi Huna, one of the great Talmudic rabbis, stated in the name of Rabbi Yossi. This, you'll notice, is a common stylistic way that the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Talmud speak. When someone says something, a learning that he did not originally come up with, but he heard from someone else, according to Jewish law, you are required to quote your original source, partly because that's the nice thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Partly it's like a plagiarism thing. Don't take credit if it was someone else's teaching. And partly it comes from the story of Queen Esther in the book of Esther, when Mordechai, Esther's uncle, Mordechai the Jew, overheard that two men, Bigtan and Teresh, were planning to assassinate the king, Ahasuerus. So Mordechai, the Jew, told his niece, Queen Esther, these two guys are planning to assassinate your husband. You're probably going to be next. She told her husband, there was an investigation. It was confirmed. The plot was uncovered, and Bigtan and Teresh were hanged. And when she told her husband, she didn't just tell him, I heard a rumor. She said, I heard from Mordecai. She didn't say, Mordecai is my uncle. You may recall that was still kept secret. But she said, I heard from Mordecai the Jew, who disclosed to me he learned about this assassination plot. As a result, the king's scribes wrote in the king's diary or chronicles that the assassination plot was uncovered because of Mordecai the Jew, instead of simply saying that the wife, Queen Esther, had told him. And later in the story, it is because the king couldn't sleep at night, asked that his chronicles be read. They read the chronicles. They reminded him that Mordecai the Jew had saved his life. He asked, what did I ever do to thank him? They told him, you never did a thing to thank him. It led to a whole thing that led him to thanking Mordecai and knocking off Haman, end of story. Consequently, we have a tradition in Judaism. You must always quote your source when you have something good to quote. Okay, so Rav Huna is quoting Rabbi Yossi, and he's talking about that night that David fled to Ramah to spend a night with the prophet Samuel. Ba'oto halayla shabarach David milfnei Shaul, on that night that David fled from Saul, Lamad mishmuel hanavi, ma she'ein talmid vatik lamad l'mea shana. He learned more during that night with Samuel, Shmuel, than a great, brilliant scholar would learn in 100 years. It turned to an amazing blessing. In that night, this young shepherd gained the wisdom, knowledge, Torah education, Judaic education that a great Torah scholar would not gather in 100 years. That's what he gained that night. And you could imagine if you've ever been to a school where you had a great mind, a great professor, or anyone great. And if you could have just 12 hours alone with that person, knowing that everything is on the line, what you would come out of with that night would be unbelievable. I never met a prophet on that level, but I had 2 or 3 experiences in my life where I had a 4-hour discussion with a particular rabbi. It changed my life. I was a college student. There was a particular rabbi who was not an average rabbi, but a world-famous rabbi. And for reasons that are outside the parameters of today's class, he ended up in my dormitory room talking with me for 4 hours. And in those 4 hours, he convinced me as a college sophomore at Columbia to not go forward with my plans to be a lawyer and instead to start thinking about becoming a rabbi. And it changed my entire life. And if you enjoy these classes, you owe him. And if you don't enjoy these classes, don't blame me, blame him. Okay, we go back. So that was the Midrash that David learned so much that night. Let's continue as we go forward with the text. I hope you also enjoy my bringing in Midrash and Talmud to flesh out the deeper story. Well, the word got back to King Saul that David is on the loose. It didn't get back to him that he is with Prophet Samuel, but simply that he's on the run, and he ended up in a particular place. And I'm going to read this in English. It's kind of interesting, these last 4 verses of the chapter. When it was told to Saul, okay, let's get 20. Saul sent messengers to take David. And it happened to be, he was at Benayot, a place where there were many prophets. So Samuel is the famous prophet of that generation, but it was a place where there were a lot of Nevi'im. There were a lot of prophets there who also prophesied. It was a time in history. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, with Shmuel the Navi, Samuel leading them in prophecy, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they suddenly became prophets. They lost their purpose of pursuing David and underwent a spiritual renaissance, a spiritual awakening. Next thing you knew, they're standing and they're prophesying with everyone else. Well, when Saul was told that his messengers, they're all prophets now. They became religious. They're like, I mean, to distinguish, I'm not saying it's the same thing as monks. It's a different religion. Monasteries is Catholicism, and certain orders of Catholicism, let's say. But to give you that image, there's nothing in the modern world that quite compares to it. So think of a monastery. Again, we're not talking about a monastery. We're not talking about monks. But imagine someone goes to a monastery to try, he finds out there's someone hiding in a monastery, and they send 10 people into the monastery to arrest them. The next thing you know, these 10 people have become monks in the same order. So he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent more messengers, and they also prophesied. So the next thing is, he's got, like, I don't know, 5, 10, 30, 40 people now are all in this prophetic order, and no one's getting David. So he decided to go himself. He went to Ramah, and he said, where's Shmuel and David? Where are the prophet? And they said, they're Benayot. They're in Ramah. That's the greater town where Samuel is. And they prophesied. So Saul himself went there. And the Spirit of God came on him, and he prophesied. He lost his focus on what he was there for. The next thing you knew, he was suddenly involved in like a spiritual fervor. Stripped off his clothes, prophesied before the prophet, laid down naked all that day like in a religious fervor. And the next thing you know, people were saying it became an expression. Hagam Shaul Banaviyim. What, Saul's also a prophet now? Now, this eventually, he didn't remain a prophet. He snapped out of it, let's say. But David was safe. We've got a few moments more. We still have some time, which is part of the plan as we go into chapter 20. So David makes a run for it, and he leaves Ramah while everybody's busy prophesying. Again, I'm thinking a little bit, it's not the same, but I'm just thinking of the Sound of Music, with Julie Mary Poppins, what's her name? Andrews. And you may remember the Nazis come looking for the family and the Von Trapps, and they end up at the monastery. And you may remember the sisters, the nun, not a monastery, a convent or nunnery, I don't know. And you may remember the nuns help hide the Von Trapps. And then when the Nazis finally figured out that the Von Trapps had fled, and it turned out that the sisters had let the air out of the tires of the Nazis' cars, so they couldn't pursue the Von Trapps. And if it hadn't been for that, we never would have gotten to hear the song Edelweiss. So not only did they save a family, but they really gave us a really sweet song. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, dum da 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 dum. So anyway, and for those of you who ever saw the 3 seasons of Ted Lasso on Apple Plus TV, the last episode, you get to hear something like that. Okay. Anyway, see what you pick up. You pick up Talmud, you get Mishnah, you get Midrash, and you get Ted Lasso. What other Navi class gives you these things? And that's only in one chapter. Who knows what's coming next? I don't even know. Okay, chapter 20. So David flees into the next place, and he again encounters Yonatan. And he says, what in the world did I do wrong? What is my sin against your father? That he wants to kill me. And Jonathan said, no, God forbid, you're not going to be killed. Chalila, God forbid. That's actually modern day Hebrew. Chalila means God forbid. Also like chas v'shalom. God forbid, you're not going to be killed. Hine lo ya'aseh avi davar gadol davar katan v'leigler ozni. It happens to be that I have a relationship with my father such that he never would do anything to rock a boat for good or for bad without telling me. It's part of the way he's rearing me to be the next king. He wants me to learn how to be a king. So he shares his every administrative and political thought with me so I could understand how he does things. If you've ever been to the musical or seen the movie The Yul Brynner movie, The King and I. It's the way the king of Siam, little by little, is always teaching his oldest son how to be a king. If you remember, I mean, okay, so we not only have Ted Lasso, we even brought in King of Siam. And we haven't even gotten through chapter 20, just one verse. Who knows, by the time we're done, Kavalei Mizrab, Phantom of the Opera. By the way, Siam now is called Thailand. If you're wondering, like, whatever became of Siam, you don't hear about him a lot. It's because it got renamed Thailand. The only references now you ever hear to Siam is Sam I am Siam or something like that. Okay, so go to Dr. Seuss. Here we go. So dad doesn't do anything without disclosing it to me. If my father would want to kill you, he would tell me. So David said to him, look, your dad knows, Jonathan, that you really, really are like my best friend, and that you and I are incredibly tight. And so, and I'm wondering whether maybe he's thinking to himself, Jonathan loves David so much, I'm not going to tell Jonathan my plans to kill David because it'll distress him. And therefore, I don't know. I don't know. So Yonatan says, tell you what, let's come up with this plan. Tomorrow is the first of the month. It's the big public monthly celebration. Dad sits at the dais with me. Anochi Eshev im HaMelech. I sit at that dais to eat with him. V'shilachtani v'nistarti v'asadeh at ha'erev hashlishi. Normally, you also sit there as the country's most famous general and his personal harpist. Skip tomorrow. Don't show up. Stay away for 2 days. And let me see what I can find out. Impakod yifkedeni avicha. And so basically, David is coming up with this plan, saying it to Saul. So let me absent myself for a day or two. And let's see if your father notices I'm not there. And if he notices I'm not there, then if he asks, where am I? So tell him, Dad, David asked my permission to be absent from this month's festivities because he has a family celebration to attend. And I told him, sure, go ahead. David says, see how your father reacts. If he gets furious upon hearing that you personally consented to my absence for 2 days, then we know that he intends to really do me in. Please do me this kindness. We have a covenant, a life covenant, caring for each other. Because really, if I've sinned against your father, you go ahead and kill me, because I would deserve it. And Yonatan says, Chalilullah, God forbid. God forbid. You haven't done anything against Dad. We'll find out now, using your approach, what's going on in my dad's mind. Does he want to hurt you, or was this again a passing spell? So David says, how are you going to tell me? I'm going to be in hiding. And you're a public figure. Everybody sees you. How are you going to meet with me to tell me? It's not like you could have a secret telephone. This is 2,000 years ago. There's no more than that. There's like 2,500. There's no phones. There's no email. How are you going to tell me? So Yonatan says, here, let's do it this way. There's this field we're in right now, outside like the town center where the big celebration takes place. Let's go into the field. Come with me right now into the field. Okay. There's nobody here. So Yonatan says to David, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going, by God, I'm going to inquire of my father and get to the bottom of what he's planning by the third day. Tov el David below oz eshlach elecha, begaliti et aznecha. Now, if it turns out that I'm able to determine that Dad really intends good for you and has no plan to hurt you, I'm going to come right out here into the field, and no need to hide from you because you're safe. And I'll tell you, you're safe. I guarantee it. And we don't have to do anything fancy. And if people happen to notice, I'm saying, what do they care? What does he care? Because I'll have determined that Dad is okay with you. On the other hand, if it turns out that my dad intends otherwise, here's the plan. So I'm going to tell you to get lost, to get away. If it turns out that my father intends hara'a ilacha, to do evil to you, begaliti dasnecha, I will let your ears know this, and I will send you v'halachta l'shalom, and you'll leave in peace. And may God be with you. V'Hashem v'yihi Hashem imach ka'asher haya im avi. And may God be with you as he always had been with my father. V'lo imodeni chai, v'lo ta'aseh imadi chesed Hashem v'lo amut. All I ask of you is that while I, Jonathan, remain alive, please only do me kindness. And who knows what the future is going to hold? And basically, unspoken, who knows whether I, Jonathan, will be around to see that future. So I ask of you, I have figured out, essentially, you are going to be the next king. He doesn't say this, but it's implied. I figured this out already, just as my dad has. I love you all the same. And I ask only that if I'm not around, please watch my kids, watch over my family. Please don't let my family be cut off. Let it not be that it should be that just as God cuts off the enemies of David, let him cut off your enemies. And they made a covenant at that moment. By Yosef Yonatan lashpieta v'babato, and Yonatan further swore to David his love, ki ahavat nafsho ahivo. He loved him with all his heart. Truly, two brothers. By Yormalo Yonatan machar chodesh. So Yonatan said, tomorrow is the first of the month. V'nifkadeta ki paked moshevecha. You're going to be missed. Let me figure out what's going on. And then here's the plan. You wait at this particular rock formation or gigantic boulder here in this forest. As I said, if Dad intends for good, I'll come right forward and tell you. Coast is clear, all is good. I don't care that other people will be around me as a retinue, seeing me with you, because you're safe. But if I determine that Dad intends to hurt you, harm you, kill you, I can't directly come face to face with you because I'll be leading others to you and endangering you. So if things are bad, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come into the forest with my weapon, with my nosei kelim, with a person who bears my weapons. And I'm going to come with like bows and arrows, a bow and arrows. And I'm going to shoot 3 arrows. I'm going to shoot 3 arrows. And here's what happens. If I say to the guy who's with me, come and pick up the arrows, that means all's well. There's peace. Because I'm beginning to realize I'm not going to be able to know where you're hiding, because you're going to be hiding just in case it's bad news. So be on the listen. And if you hear me saying to the young man, go ahead and take the arrows and come on and come, all's well. But if I shoot the arrows extra far so that I have to say to the young man, behold, the arrows are beyond, go away, go far away to get the arrows, Listen carefully. If I say, go away to him, I'm saying it to you. It means God has sent you away. All right. But no matter what, the Lord is between me and you forever. So David hid himself in the field, and the new moon came, and the king sat down at the dais to eat at the big public celebration. And the king sat at his seat, and he's by the wall, and his son Jonathan is right next to him and stands up. And Avner, his chief of the military staff, David was a general, but you know, the difference between a general in the field and the chief of staff. Like in America, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chief of the army, the chief of the navy. Avner's the chief of staff, he stood up, but David's chair, his seat at the dais was empty. King is there, son Jonathan is there, chief of staff is there, David's missing. So Saul didn't say anything. For he thought, I don't know. Now you need to know, in Jewish law in those days, it's not applicable now. If a man would have an emission of semen, whether being intimate with his wife or some other, let's say at night while asleep or whatever, that would make him not pure. And the next morning he would have to go to a mikveh to immerse in a ritual body of water during the day hours, and he would be regarded as ritually pure when the sun came down at sunset. It's the opposite for women. Once a month, when their time to go to the mikveh, they go at night and are immediately ritually pure after immersing in a mikveh, a ritual body of water. But for men, it was in the daytime, and you stayed out of the camp of Israel all day with other men. And it was not a source of embarrassment. It's not like you might think, well, this is embarrassing. It was understood. People are married and they have good marriage, and it's a sign they have a good marriage. So there would be people every day who would be coming back at the end of the day. So Saul did not see David and assumed normally David's always here, and he's not here today. Perhaps he's gone out to a mikveh. And it's, you know, it's nothing to be embarrassed about, but proper people don't discuss it. In Judaism, we don't discuss certain things. They're private. We're supposed to be a modest people. We're not the sisters of perpetual indulgence. We don't tolerate that. So Saul spoke not anything that day, for he thought something befell, and he's unclean. Surely he's not clean. And the Talmud picks up, by the way, that he doesn't think to himself he is impure. The word tameh, rather non-tahor. Tahor means pure. He's not pure versus he's dirty or impure. That the way Hebrew is spoken and the way proper people speak, they speak very elegantly. A Jew should speak elegantly. Everybody should speak elegantly. Again, there's so much coarseness in the world in which we live today. Turn on TV and you turn on the movies, and it's embarrassing to listen to some of the language. And it's not only on TV and the movies, it's in real life. Supposed to speak with an elegance. I remember a big thing, I've probably mentioned in the past more than once, that when the Nixon tapes came out in 1974 or 72, it turned out Nixon curses a lot in the Oval Office because he was wiretapping his own office to create a record of his presidency. And it came out when the Nixon tapes came out, the guy curses a lot, but he never cursed in public. And a lot of people said, what a hypocrite he is. Like, he's got such a clean mouth in public, he's got a filthy mouth in private. And I wrote an article at the time. I called it The Virtue of Hypocrisy. Better to be a hypocrite and not curse in public, even though you curse in private, which you shouldn't do, than to decide, well, I curse in private, so I'll curse in public. There's a virtue in hypocrisy, at least create a public image of the values to which we all should aspire. And if we can't meet those values, it gives us something to, once you kill the public standard, there's nothing to aspire to. And that's what's happened to America today, unfortunately. Okay. So the Talmud talks about that. I don't want to take the time out because I want to get this in before we break. So came the second day, and again David was missing. So Vayomer Saul, so if a person is not pure, goes to the mikveh, comes in, and he should have been there the second day. Vayomer Shaul Yonatan beno. So Saul said to his son Jonathan, where is the son of Yishai? Where is Jesse's son? Already we see he can't even bring himself to say David. He clearly, he's got a feeling. Where is Jesse's son? He wasn't here yesterday. He's not here again today to eat bread. Where is he? El Halechem, to eat bread. And Jonathan says, David had asked of me permission to absent himself to go to Bethlehem. He said he's got a family celebration. Family's having a sacrifice in the city. A family celebration. They're going to offer a sacrifice of gratitude to thanksgiving to God. And he asked permission to be with the rest of the family. And so I told him, yeah, okay. And that's why he's not here. Oh, Saul got angry. Saul's anger was kindled against Yonatan. He knew the score and said, you son of a perverse rebellion, you moron. That's really what he's saying. Ben Na'avad Hamardut, you rebellious son, and you moron. Do you not know that I know that you prefer David over yourself to your own shame? You would support him to be the next king, even though you're next in line. To the shame of your mother's nakedness. You're an embarrassment. What kind of man are you? For as long as he won't say David, he hates him that much at this moment. For as long as the son of Jesse lives, you will never become king. You'll never have how could you do that? He deserves to die. Yonatan was trying to persuade his daddy, wherefore should he be put to death? What has he done? And Saul didn't want to hear this. He took a spear. He was going to kill his own son. And Yonatan knew, he really means it this time. He's really going to kill David. So Yonatan arose from the table, putting on the face of anger. He wasn't really angry, but he put on a show of anger so that he would have an excuse to quickly exit the festival. And he raced to tell David what's going on. And also his father publicly, in the presence of all the leaders of the kingdom, his father shamed him. And so he went out into that field with his nosei kelim, with the young fellow who would bear his bow and arrows and his weapons. And he shot an arrow, and he did it too far on purpose. And he said, find the arrows which I shoot. He shot an arrow beyond him, too far. And as the lad was about to get there, Yonatan cried out and said, is not the arrow farther away, beyond you? Make speed, hasten. Don't remain there. Keep going. And that was the signal to David. Yonatan's lad, who finally got those arrows, had no idea what was going on, that there was a secret code going on. David and Jonathan knew. And so the nosei kelim, the person who carried the weapons, brought back the arrows, gave them to Yonatan. Yonatan said, here, look, take the arrows, take the bow, go back to the city. I'll be there. I'm just taking a little break. I'll be behind you a little while. And after the young fellow left, Yonatan saw there was no one else whatsoever in that area of the forest. So it was safe for David to come out. He prostrated himself to Yonatan 3 times. They kissed one another and wept, knowing they very probably would never see each other again. As we close for tonight, Yonatan said, "Vayomer Yonatan leDavid lech leShalom." Yonatan said, "Go in shalom, go in peace." Asher nishbanu shneinu ach nachnu b'shem Hashem le'mor. As the two of us swore to each other in the name of God, as we said, Hashem yihya beini uveinecha uvein zari uvein zarecha ad olam. May God be between me, between you and me, between my seed and your seed, forever. And David fled, knowing that Saul now absolutely intended to kill him. And no matter that Saul occasionally would bounce out of it and refrain from that, he now knew he no longer safely could rely on that. And he had to flee. And essentially he's not going to see Jonathan again. And that's where we end tonight's class at the end of chapter 20. We always try to cover 2 chapters, and God willing, next week, 2 more chapters. Thank you so much for being here with me. And Thursday, as always, we do Mishnah, the laws right now, Baba Metzia, of finding items and contracts, acquiring items. And then on Sunday, we will go into like part 8 or 9 of the Rise of Israel. We'll be covering a little bit more about the Haganah, the rise of the Israeli, the War of Independence. And if we have time, we'll be covering the tragedy and historic significance of Gush Etzion. So thank you for being here. And Laila Tov, have a great week.
Laila Tov.
Bye-bye.